I thought it was just another Tuesday morning in October, the kind so ordinary and golden it almost hurts. Coffee on the stove, the smell of chrysanthemums drifting in from the back garden, the familiar creak of the third porch step under the postman's boot. I had no reason to believe that day was anything other than one more soft, unhurried day in the house I had lived in for 35 years. I had no way of knowing my firstborn child had already sold it out from under me. She walked up my front path at 9:10 with a smile I had never seen on her before. Not warm, not cold exactly, just resolved. The way a person looks when they have already made a decision and simply need to announce it. And she said the words I never imagined hearing from my own daughter. "Start packing, Mom. I sold your house. You're moving into a nursing home." I looked at her for a long moment, and I felt something settle inside me, something very quiet and very still, like water going flat before a storm. And I said, "Come in, sweetheart. You should see this." She stepped through the door she had grown up running through, and the color left her face so quickly it was as if someone had pulled a drain. But I am getting ahead of myself. I want you to understand who I was before that morning and who I was by the end of it, because the distance between those two women is the whole point of this story. My name is Margaret Ann Calloway. I was 67 years old that October, a retired school teacher, a widow of 4 years, and the owner, the sole, legal, fully documented owner, of a white clapboard house on Birchwood Lane in a small town in central Vermont. It was not a grand house. It never was. 3 bedrooms, a sunroom that leaked in heavy rain until Harold finally fixed the seals the summer before he died. A kitchen with butter yellow walls that I painted myself in 1998 and never saw a reason to change. And a back garden that was, without question, the most beautiful thing I had ever made with my own hands. Harold and I had bought that house in the spring of 1989, 3 months after our wedding, with a down payment scraped together from his overtime pay at the machine shop and the money my mother had left me when she passed. We had signed the papers at a laminate-top table in a lawyer's office that smelled of cigarettes and old carpet, and Harold had held my hand the whole time. And when we walked out into the March sunshine holding our copies of the deed, he had lifted me off the ground and turned me in a circle right there on the sidewalk. I always loved that memory. I still do. We raised 2 children in that house. Robert, our son, was born the year after we moved in. A quiet, steady boy who grew into a quiet, steady man and now lives in Seattle, where he designs bridges for a civil engineering firm and calls me every Sunday without fail. And then there was Diane Louise Calloway, now Diane Hartwell, my eldest by 14 months, born in the upstairs bedroom on a blizzard night in January when the roads were too bad for Harold to get the car out, and our neighbor, Mrs. Pecorino, delivered her by lamplight with her sleeves rolled up and a calmness that I have never forgotten. Diane arrived in this world loudly, emphatically, with her chin up, and she had never really changed. She was the child who corrected her teachers, who reorganized the kitchen cabinets without being asked, who told me, at the age of 12, that my flower beds would look better if I moved the hostas to the north side. She was exhausting and magnificent in equal measure, and I loved her with a particular helpless love that mothers carry for difficult children, a love that is always slightly bruised around the edges, always slightly apologetic for reasons you cannot quite name. She had married Kevin Hartwell 11 years ago. Kevin was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a pleasant face and the conversational range of a weather forecast. He worked in commercial real estate. I had always been mildly wary of this fact in the way that you are wary of a perfectly harmless-looking plant that you once read can sometimes be toxic. Kevin appraised things. That was what he did, professionally and personally. He looked at rooms, at houses, at landscapes, and calculated their value in dollars. The first time he came to Sunday dinner at Birchwood Lane, he had walked through my kitchen and said, almost to himself, "Good bones. This lot alone is worth something." Harold, who was still alive then, had looked at me across the table with that particular look of his, eyebrows fractionally raised, mouth neutral, that meant noted. I had shaken my head slightly, meaning don't. And we had moved on to the pot roast, and I had filed the moment away in the part of my mind where I kept things I had decided not to think about. After Harold died, a heart attack in April, quick and without warning, on a morning when he had been out replacing a loose board on the garden fence, the house became everything. Not in a morbid way, not in a way that trapped me, but in the way that a place where you have lived a full life becomes something more than walls and wood. It becomes the physical form of all of it, of the life itself. Harold was in that house. He was in the particular angle of afternoon light through the kitchen window, in the worn groove on the third stair where he always stepped too close to the edge, in the smell of pine resin from the woodpile beside the back door. I was not ready to leave it. I would not be for a very long time, perhaps never, and I thought, foolishly it turned out, that my children understood this. Robert understood it immediately and completely. He called every Sunday and asked about the garden, asked whether the furnace was behaving, sent me books he thought I might like, and visited at Christmas with his wife, Clara, and their 2 boys, who ran through the house the way children should. He never once suggested I might be better off somewhere else. He never once looked at the walls and calculated. Diane was different. The changes in her, looking back now, began perhaps 6 months after Harold's funeral, though at the time I noticed them only as a kind of low-grade unease, the sort of thing you explain away repeatedly until the explanations themselves start to feel suspicious. She began visiting more frequently. This, taken in isolation, was a kindness. She would arrive on Saturday afternoons, sometimes with Kevin, sometimes alone, always with a casserole or a tray of something baked, and she would sit at my kitchen table and drink tea and talk, and the conversation would eventually, gently, settle on the house. Was I finding the upkeep too much? Was the yard a strain? Had I thought about what might make more sense long-term? She delivered these questions in the tone of someone raising a topic purely out of love and practicality, the way a concerned daughter should, and each time I said I was fine, that the house was manageable, that I had no intention of going anywhere, she would nod and smile and say, "Of course, Mom, of course. I just want to make sure you're okay." And the conversation would move on. But it was always there, just beneath the surface of every visit, like a stone submerged in shallow water. You could see it, but you could tell yourself the water made it look bigger than it was. Kevin started joining the visits more regularly toward the end of that first year. He would wander while Diane and I talked, not rudely, not conspicuously, just quietly, in the way people wander when they are counting steps or checking sightlines. Once I came back from the garden to find him in the front hall with his phone out, taking a photograph of the ceiling medallion above the stairs. I asked him what he was doing. He said he was just admiring the original plasterwork. I said, "I see." And I did see, a little more than I had before. But I was 66 years old and I was tired of conflict, and I chose, again, to explain it away. The strange envelopes began arriving in February. Not many, 3 over the course of 6 weeks, and all from the same company, Vantage Property Solutions, LLC, a commercial development firm based in Burlington. The first 2 were addressed to me but contained only what appeared to be boilerplate correspondence about property assessments in my neighborhood, the kind of generic mailing that occasionally arrives from developers fishing for willing sellers. I set them aside without much thought. The third one gave me pause. It was addressed not to me but to the estate of Harold R. Calloway, and it referenced, in its second paragraph, a preliminary valuation of the property at 14 Birchwood Lane in connection with a forthcoming transaction. I read that line 3 times. I had not initiated any transaction. Harold's estate had been fully settled 2 years prior, with no complications, his assets transferred to me as the surviving spouse, the house remaining in my name. There was no transaction forthcoming. I called Diane that evening. I mentioned the letter in passing, keeping my voice casual, curious rather than alarmed, and watched her response the way you watch a person's face when you ask a question you already half know the answer to. There was a pause. Not long, barely a second, before she said, "Oh, that's probably just junk mail, Mom. Developers send those things to everybody. Don't worry about it." She said it lightly, breezy, dismissive, and then immediately redirected the conversation to her daughter Emma's school project, and I let her because I was not yet ready for what I was beginning to suspect. I kept the letter. I put it in the green folder in my filing cabinet, the one where I kept important documents, and I closed the drawer carefully, and I stood for a moment in the quiet of my study with my hand on the cabinet handle and thought, something is wrong. I thought, I am going to need to be careful. It was my neighbor, Dorothy Schubert, a woman of 73 who had lived across Birchwood Lane for 20 years and who possessed both a sharp eye and absolutely no patience for subtlety, who forced the matter into the open. She called me on a Wednesday morning in late September, before I had finished my first cup of coffee, and she said, "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I need you not to be offended because I'm asking out of friendship." I told her to go ahead. She said, "There's been a man on your property twice this week. Not the postman, not a utility worker. A man in a suit with a clipboard, measuring things. And yesterday there was a woman with him, and she had what looked like architectural drawings. They were out front for nearly an hour." I set down my coffee cup. My hand was very steady. I said, "Thank you, Dorothy." I said it quietly, and I meant it as though it were the most important thing anyone had said to me in months, because it was. That afternoon, I drove to the offices of Gerald Marsh, who had been my attorney for 22 years and who had handled Harold's estate, the property transfer, all of it. Gerald was a compact, precise man in his mid-60s who wore bow ties and kept his office in a state of organized density that suggested he had read every document in it within the last 48 hours. I sat across his desk and told him everything: the letters, Kevin's phone, the surveyors Dorothy had described, the long campaign of gentle questioning about the future of the house. I told him about the letter addressed to Harold's estate and a forthcoming transaction I knew nothing about. I watched Gerald's expression as I spoke. He was good at keeping his face neutral, the professional blankness of a man trained to listen without reacting. But toward the end, something shifted in his eyes. Not alarm, exactly, but a kind of narrowing alertness, a sharpening, as though he were drawing a line from one point to another and arriving somewhere he had hoped not to arrive. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Margaret, I want you to do something for me. I want you to go home, and I want you to check, very carefully, whether you still have your original deed, your property tax statements for the last 2 years, and any correspondence you have with the county assessor's office. Asked him why. He looked at me directly and said, because if someone has filed a forged power of attorney or fraudulent transfer documents on this property, the county recorder's office will have a record of it, and we need to know what we're dealing with before we do anything else. I drove home faster than usual. The October light had turned harsh and bright, the kind that reveals everything without softening it, and the maples along Birchwood Lane were burning red and gold, and I noticed none of it. I went directly to my filing cabinet. I opened the green folder. The deed was there, intact, exactly as it should have been. But beside it, slightly out of order, as though someone had leafed through the folder and not replaced everything precisely, and I was precise. I had always been precise. Every document in that cabinet was where I had put it. There was a gap where my original letter of title insurance should have been. A small gap, easily explained. But I stood there for a long time looking at it, and the smell of Harold's pipe tobacco seemed to come from nowhere, though he had been gone 4 years, and the smell had long since faded from the house, and I thought, they have already been here. I thought, they have already been in this house going through my things. I thought, Diane has a key. I called Gerald from the kitchen phone. He told me he had already started pulling county records. He told me to come back in the morning. He told me, with the kind of measured care that carries more weight than alarm, to call no one in the family that evening. I asked him why. He said, because I think we may be dealing with a situation where the person who has harmed you has access to information about what you know, and we need to move carefully. I said, how serious is this, Gerald? And he said, after a pause that I will remember for the rest of my life, Margaret, I don't want to speculate until I've seen the records, but I want you to know that you called me in time. Whatever has happened, you called me in time. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark in the bedroom I had shared with Harold for 30 years and listened to the house breathe around me, the tick and settle of the radiators, the soft percussion of a branch against the sunroom window, the deep quiet of a place that has been loved a long time. And I thought about Diane. I thought about her at 5 years old, sitting in the back garden with her shoes off, making a necklace out of clover blossoms, her dark hair in 2 crooked braids. I thought about her at 16, furious at me over something I can no longer remember, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the frame. I thought about her at 38, standing at the edge of Harold's grave in the cold April rain, with her face absolutely still, not crying, not moving, just standing the way a person stands when they are holding something inside them that is too large for grief. I had always thought that stillness was love. I had always thought it was the form her love took, her controlled, practical, unsentimental love. I lay in the dark and considered the possibility that I had been wrong about that for a long time. Gerald called me at 8 the next morning. His voice was the careful, level voice of someone delivering the results of a medical test they already knew would be bad. He said, Margaret, I've pulled the records from the county recorder's office. In August, 6 weeks ago, a document was filed claiming to transfer power of attorney over your property to Diane Louise Hartwell, with a notarized signature attributed to you. I was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold, and I said, I never signed anything. He said, I know. I've seen your signature on half a dozen documents in my files, Margaret. This is not your signature." I said nothing. He continued. "On the basis of that document, a preliminary sale agreement was filed 3 weeks ago, selling 14 Birchwood Lane to Vantage Property Solutions, LLC, for $340,000. The closing date was set for the 15th of November. The 15th of November, 5 weeks away. 5 weeks from now, my house where Harold had fixed the porch steps and painted the sunroom and died on an ordinary morning replacing a loose fence board, would belong to a commercial developer, and I would presumably be in a nursing home somewhere, and the garden would be torn up, and the butter yellow kitchen would be gutted, and 35 years of a life would be erased for $340,000 that would go into my daughter's bank account. The tea mug was very cold in my hands. The kitchen was very bright. The chrysanthemums outside the window were orange and rust and gold, and the morning was perfectly, cruelly beautiful, and I sat in the middle of it and felt the ground tilt beneath me and tilt again. And then, after a long moment that seemed to carry a decade inside it, I felt it go still. "Gerald," I said, "tell me exactly what we need to do." We met at his office that same morning. He had already been in contact with Detective Sandra Mills of the Vermont State Police Financial Crimes Unit, whom he described as thorough, experienced, and deeply unimpressed with the increasing frequency of elder financial abuse cases crossing her desk. He had also, on a separate matter that took me completely by surprise, made a call to Robert, my son, in Seattle. Gerald told me this with the particular delicacy of someone who suspects the news may land awkwardly, and he explained that in situations like this, it was often advisable to have a trusted family member present who was not involved in the scheme, both for legal purposes and for the simple reason that no one should face something like this alone. I was quiet for a moment, and then I said, "He shouldn't have to fly out for this." Gerald looked at me over the rim of his glasses and said, "He already booked the flight." Robert arrived Thursday evening. I heard his rental car pull into the driveway, and I went to the door, and we stood there on the porch for a moment in the evening cold, the oak tree dropping leaves onto the lawn in slow spirals, and he looked at me with those steady gray eyes he had inherited from Harold, and he said, "You okay, Mom?" I said, "I'm gonna be." He hugged me, and he was solid and warm and smelled of the same soap he had used since college, and I held on for a moment longer than I normally would, and he let me. And then we went inside and sat at the kitchen table, and I told him all of it. He listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without changing his expression, with the complete and deliberate attention of someone who is not just hearing words, but building a structure from them, cataloging each piece, placing it in relation to the others. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "She has a key to this house." I said, "Yes," he said. "And she's been in your filing cabinet." I said, "Yes." He said very quietly, "I should have come home more." I shook my head. I said, "This is not on you, Robert." He looked at his hands on the table. He said, "No, it's on Diane." Detective Mills came to the house Friday morning. She was a compact woman in her 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of attentiveness that felt like a physical pressure in the room. Nothing aggressive, simply the sense that nothing escaped her. She sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a recording device and asked me to walk her through everything from the beginning, and I did. And she asked precise, targeted questions at intervals, the kind designed not to lead but to sharpen, to pull specific details into focus. She examined the letter from Vantage Property Solutions. She examined the gap in my filing folder. She took photographs of both. Gerald had already provided her with copies of the forged power of attorney and the sale agreement from the county recorder's office, and she had them laid out on the table in a clear plastic sleeve, and she tapped the signature, the thing that was supposed to be my signature, with one finger, and said, "We're going to have a handwriting analyst confirm this, but based on your authenticated signatures in the existing documents, I can tell you that no analyst is going to have trouble with this one." She looked up at me. She said, "Mrs. Calloway, are you prepared to press charges?" I looked back at her. I said, "Detective Mills, I am prepared to do whatever is necessary to make sure my daughter never does this to another person, whether it is me or someone else." The plan was straightforward and required only one thing from me: patience. Gerald filed an emergency injunction with the county court on Friday afternoon, freezing the sale and flagging the power of attorney as disputed. The injunction was granted within hours, which Gerald explained was unusual but not remarkable, given the clarity of the forgery. The sale to Vantage Property Solutions was legally suspended pending investigation. Detective Mills had already been in contact with the Burlington office of the developer and made clear that any party knowingly involved in a transaction based on a fraudulent document would face civil and potentially criminal exposure. A conversation that, by her account, produced a level of cooperation from Vantage's legal team that she found entirely satisfactory. Vantage, it emerged, had dealt with Kevin Hartwell on several previous transactions and had taken the power of attorney at face value, as a legitimate document handled by a licensed real estate professional. Kevin had represented himself as a facilitating agent. He had not disclosed his familial relationship to me. He had not disclosed that I was alive, present, mentally competent, and completely unaware that my home was being sold. I knew, by Friday evening, all of this. I knew about the forged document. I knew about Kevin's involvement. I knew that Diane had arranged for a placement coordinator at a residential care facility called Sycamore Ridge to assess me, without my knowledge, without my consent, for a semi-private room in their memory care wing, a classification that required a diagnosis of cognitive impairment that I did not have, had never had, and had never been evaluated for. I knew that someone, and Detective Mills was working on this, had submitted a letter to Sycamore Ridge purportedly from my primary care physician, Dr. Anand Patel, describing a progressive decline in cognitive function consistent with early-stage dementia. Dr. Patel, when contacted, was horrified. He had written no such letter. He had never had reason to write such a letter. He had seen me for my annual physical 6 weeks prior and had found me in excellent health. He was, by all accounts, furious and had provided Detective Mills with a written statement within the hour. There it was, the full shape of it revealed at last, not an impulsive act, not a moment of greed that overtook better judgment. A plan, a careful, layered, premeditated plan. Forge the power of attorney, arrange the sale, fabricate a medical diagnosis, secure the nursing home placement, execute the transfer, collect $340,000, have me disappear into a memory care ward where, as a woman they had preemptively labeled as cognitively impaired. Any protest I made could be dismissed as confusion, as the sad deterioration of an old woman who no longer understood her own situation. The elegance of it, from a criminal perspective, was genuinely terrible. The contempt of it, for me, for Harold, for everything the house represented, for my mind, my dignity, my entire life, was something I could not hold in my chest without it burning. I stood at the kitchen window that Friday evening with the last of the sunset going copper over the garden, and I let it burn, and then I breathed it out, and I thought, tomorrow she would come. I knew she would come because Gerald had confirmed that the closing documents had been sent to Diane's address for final execution, and the timeline she had set required her to move me before the 15th of November, and she had never in her life failed to act on a schedule. She would come, and she would deliver her announcement, and she would expect me to react the way she had calculated I would react, with confusion, with distress, with the helpless capitulation of a woman she had already decided was too old and too diminished to fight back. She had planned for every contingency except the one that would actually occur, that her mother had spent a week building a room full of evidence and the people who knew how to use it. I called Robert into the kitchen that night, and we sat together with the lights low and the smell of pine from the woodpile coming through the back door, and I told him what was going to happen the next morning. He listened without speaking. When I finished, he said, "Are you sure you want to be there for this?" I said, "Robert, this is my house." He looked at me the way Harold used to look at me when I said something he recognized as final, as the last word, as the statement that closes a subject. He nodded. He said, "Okay." And then he said, "She's going to be shocked." I said, "Good." Gerald arrived at 8:15 on Saturday morning, carrying his briefcase and wearing his most formal bow tie, the dark burgundy one he reserved, as far as I knew, for occasions that required the full weight of his professional authority. Detective Mills arrived at 8:30 in plain clothes, dark trousers, a gray jacket, but with her badge and a colleague, a younger detective named Paul Whelan, who stationed himself near the front hall with the relaxed readiness of someone who has done this many times. I had made coffee. I had put out the cups. The kitchen smelled of coffee and the last of the chrysanthemums from the garden, which I had cut and put in a vase on the table that morning because I wanted the room to feel like mine, wholly and unmistakably mine when my daughter walked into it. Robert sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface, quiet and steady. Gerald stood near the window. Detective Mills sat in the chair closest to the hallway door, and I stood at the kitchen counter in my own home in the morning light that I had watched move across this room for 35 years, and I waited. She arrived at 9:10. I heard the car, Kevin's black SUV, park at the curb rather than in the driveway, and I thought she was planning to leave quickly. I heard the click of her heels on the front path, that decisive, forward-tilting stride I had known her whole life. And then the knock. 3 sharp, brisk raps, the knock of someone who considers the formality of knocking a courtesy they are extending, not a request for permission. I crossed the front hall. I opened the door. She was wearing a coat I had not seen before, dark green, expensive, and she was carrying a leather portfolio, and she had her real estate face on, composed, confident, with that particular expression of resolved compassion that people wear when they are about to deliver news they have decided is for your own good. She opened her mouth, and then she said it. "Mom, I'm glad you're here. I need to talk to you about some arrangements I've made. You're going to be moving. I found a really lovely place. It's called Sycamore Ridge, and they have a spot for you starting the end of the month. I know this is a lot to take in, but the house has been sold, and I think you're going to see that this is really the best." I held up one hand. I said, "Come in, sweetheart. You should see this." And I stepped back, and she followed me down the front hall and into the kitchen doorway, and she stopped. The silence that followed was unlike any I have ever heard. It was not the silence of a pause or a hesitation. It was the silence of a mind hitting something solid, a wall, an obstacle, the absolute, unmovable fact of something that cannot be incorporated into the plan that was just, seconds ago, the entire architecture of her morning. Robert looked up from the table and said, "Hey, Di." Diane's eyes moved from him to Gerald, who stood by the window with his briefcase open on the counter and a document in his hand. They moved to Detective Mills, who had stood when Diane entered the room and who now said, calmly and without preamble, "Ms. Hartwell, I'm Detective Sandra Mills of the Vermont State Police Financial Crimes Unit. I need to advise you that you are not required to speak with me at this time, but I would ask you to remain in the room, as there are some matters we need to discuss." Diane's portfolio slipped in her fingers. She caught it. Her other hand went to the door frame. The color had left her face as completely as if a switch had been thrown, and her eyes moved to mine, and in them I saw, for the first and only time in my life, something that looked like pure and unmediated fear. "Mom," she said. Her voice was different now. The resolved authority had collapsed. She sounded suddenly younger than I had heard her sound in years. "Mom, I can explain." "I know you can," I said. "I've been watching you explain things your whole life." I said it quietly. I crossed the kitchen and stood at the table, and I said, "Sit down, Diane." She sat. She sat because I said to, the way she had sat at this table at 6 years old when I told her the same thing before a difficult conversation, and the familiarity of it. The terrible familiarity of it, the mother and daughter of it in the middle of this catastrophe, hit me somewhere private and deep, and I kept my face very still, and I pushed it down, and I stayed standing. Gerald set the documents on the table. He laid them out one by one. The forged power of attorney, the sale agreement, the fraudulent letter from Dr. Patel's purported signature, the placement application for Sycamore Ridge. He identified each one as he placed it. He was unhurried and precise, and absolutely merciless in the way that only truly decent people who have been genuinely angered can be. Diane looked at each document as it appeared. She did not touch them. She said nothing. Kevin was not there, and I noticed that she did not ask for him, and I thought, she knew not to bring him. I thought, she knew this might go wrong. Detective Mills took over. She explained in the same level, uninfected tone she might have used to describe a weather pattern that a forged power of attorney is a felony in the state of Vermont, punishable by up to 15 years imprisonment. That fraudulent conveyance of real property carries additional charges, that the fabricated medical documentation, bearing a physician's name and credentials without his authorization, constituted identity fraud and medical fraud, separate charges, each with their own penalties. She explained that Kevin Hartwell's involvement as the executing real estate agent in a transaction he knew or should have known to be fraudulent exposed him to professional sanctions from the State Real Estate Board as well as potential criminal liability. She explained all of this in the tone of someone reciting facts because that is what they were. Facts, not threats. Facts that existed regardless of what Diane said or did not say in the next 5 minutes. Diane was very still. I had seen her like this before, at Harold's graveside, at the edge of things too large to absorb. And I understood, watching her now, that what I had always read as stoic control was something more complicated than that. She said, "I did it for you." She said it to the table. She said, "You couldn't take care of this house anymore. You were alone. You were going to fall or get sick, or I just wanted to make sure you were taken care of." She looked up at me then. "I was trying to take care of you, Mom." The room was very quiet. Robert made a sound that was not quite a word. I looked at my daughter across the table that had sat in this kitchen for 35 years, where she had eaten 1,000 meals and done her homework and argued with her father and cried after her first heartbreak and brought Kevin for the first time and sat after Harold's funeral with cold tea going untouched in her cup. And I looked at her and I said, "Diane, you filed a document with my forged signature to sell my home without my knowledge. You arranged to have me committed to a memory care facility for a condition I do not have, using a letter with my doctor's name on it that he never wrote. You were going to take $340,000 for my house and put me in a single room in a building I had never set foot in and let me spend the rest of my life there, thinking I had no choice." I stopped. I was breathing carefully, deliberately, the way you breathe when you need the words to come out exactly right. I said, "If that is you taking care of me, I need you to stop." She opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at Gerald. She looked at Robert, who looked back at her with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not contempt, but a kind of grief that had gone past grief into something settled and immovable. He said, "Diane, don't. Just that." She understood. Detective Mills asked Diane to come with her. She explained that she would need to give a formal statement at the station, that she had the right to have an attorney present, and that Detective Whelan would escort her out. Diane stood slowly. She looked around the kitchen, at the butter-yellow walls, at the vase of chrysanthemums, at the worn groove on the edge of the table where Harold used to drum his fingers. And something moved across her face that I could not interpret and did not try to. She picked up her portfolio. She did not look at me again. She walked out of my kitchen, past the spot near the door where her height was still marked in pencil on the frame, 5'2" at age 9, 5'4" at 12, 5'6" at 15, Diane written beside each mark in Harold's handwriting, and I heard her footsteps in the front hall and the sound of the door, and then she was gone. Robert came around the table and put his arm around me. He did not say anything. I was glad he did not say anything. Gerald was already on his phone, confirming the injunction status with the county court and notifying Vantage Property Solutions' legal team that the sale was voided in full. The morning light moved across the kitchen floor the way it always had. The chrysanthemums were very orange in the vase. The coffee was still warm on the counter, and I thought abstractly that I should pour a cup. And then I thought that the cup could wait, and I stood in the middle of my kitchen, in the middle of my life, and let the realness of it settle over me. The heavy, plain, survivable realness of what had just happened and what had not. In the weeks that followed, the legal machinery turned slowly and thoroughly. Gerald filed a formal complaint with the county recorder's office to have the fraudulent power of attorney vacated from the property record, a process that was completed within 10 days. The sale to Vantage Property Solutions was formally dissolved. Their legal team, having cooperated fully with the investigation, was cleared of knowing participation in the fraud. Detective Mills, working with the state attorney's office, filed charges against Diane and Kevin jointly: felony forgery, fraudulent conveyance of real property, elder financial abuse, and identity fraud relating to the fabricated medical letter. Dr. Patel filed a separate complaint with the state medical board regarding the misuse of his credentials and provided testimony that was, by Detective Mills's account, comprehensive and entirely damning. the Vermont Real Estate Commission opened a separate disciplinary proceeding against Kevin's license, a process expected to result in suspension at minimum and likely permanent revocation. Sycamore Ridge, upon learning the full circumstances of the placement application, cooperated completely with the investigation and issued a formal apology, though they had no legal exposure. They had been as deceived as everyone else. Diane hired a lawyer. She did not call me. She did not write. Robert called her twice in the weeks after, trying, because he was Robert, because he would always try, to understand, to find some thread of explanation that could be held without entirely destroying what was left of their relationship. She told him, through her attorney's office, that she had nothing to say. Kevin, through separate counsel, had indicated a willingness to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges, a development that Gerald told me was common and that Detective Mills told me was useful. I had no particular feelings about it. I had feelings about other things. I had feelings about the morning in November when I went out into the back garden in my wool coat and pulled the last of the dead chrysanthemum stalks and turned the soil over in the beds and planted the spring bulbs, tulips and daffodils and the crocus mix I always bought at the garden center in town, pressing each one into the cold earth with the careful deliberateness of an act that is also a statement. I had feelings about the afternoon in December when Robert and Clara and the boys came for Christmas, and the house was loud with them, full of running feet and the smell of roasting meat and the sound of someone's knee connecting with the base of the Christmas tree. And I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched it all and thought, here. I had feelings about the Sunday mornings when I sat at the table with my coffee while the winter light came through the window and the house was quiet and entirely mine. Not threatened, not suspended in some legal limbo, not being appraised or measured or calculated. Just mine, the way it had always been, the way it always would be. Gerald called in January to tell me that the plea negotiations had concluded. Diane had accepted a guilty plea to 1 count of elder financial abuse and 1 count of fraudulent property transfer, avoiding trial. She received a suspended sentence of 3 years, 2 years of probation, mandatory community service, and was ordered to pay restitution for all legal costs I had incurred. Kevin's real estate license was revoked. His separate plea resulted in a fine and a 2-year suspended sentence with conditions. Gerald told me the outcome in the measured tone of a man who considers justice a craft rather than a spectacle. And I thanked him, and I meant it in the large, quiet way that you thank someone who has helped you hold on to something you almost lost forever. I did not celebrate. That had never been what I was after. What I was after was simple, to be still in my own home at the end of all of it, still standing in the place where my life was, still able to walk out into my back garden on a winter morning and see the brown earth where the bulbs were sleeping, waiting for spring, patient as everything that has ever survived, something it was not supposed to. That was all I wanted. That was the whole of it. I think about Diane sometimes. I think about the girl she was before she became the woman who did what she did. And I hold those two things side by side, and I cannot make them become each other. And I have decided that I do not need to. What I know is this: love is not a claim. Love is not an inheritance or a transaction or a right of seizure. Love does not get to decide on your behalf what your life is worth or where you should spend the rest of it or what is best for you without your knowledge or your consent. If you have raised a child and they have grown into someone who does not understand this, then the failure is not yours alone. but neither is the right to stop them when they come for what is yours. It is early spring now. The daffodils came up in March, yellow and extravagant along the back fence, exactly where I planted them in November with cold hands and considerable fury, and they are perfect. The crocus have finished, but the tulips are coming, red and cream and a deep dark purple that Harold would have liked. The fence board he was replacing 4 years ago on the morning he died, that board, I never did replace it after him. I kept meaning to, and something always stopped me. Some inability to drive the nail into that particular wood. Last week, Robert drove up for the weekend with his older boy, and on Sunday morning they fixed it together in the pale spring sunshine. And I watched from the kitchen window, and the coffee was hot, and the house was warm, and the light moved across the floor exactly as it had always moved. And I thought, this is what remains. I thought, this is what they could not take. The things that are truly yours. The years in the walls, the memories in the wood, the love that does not bargain. Those things cannot be forged or filed or transferred, cannot be sold to a developer for $340,000, cannot be folded into a leather portfolio and carried up a front path on an October morning. They live in the house itself, in the butter yellow walls and the marked door frame and the worn groove on the stair, and they will be there long after all of it. The documents, the courtrooms, the terrible year, has finally, mercifully, faded into just another thing I survived. I survived it. That is the whole story. I survived it, and I am still here, and the daffodils are extraordinary this year.